some time at the end to do questions, which will be nice. I heard a ringing there.
All right, that was me. Just in case anybody has any issues, I've started this meeting to be recorded so that we'll post it online on our new YouTube channel after the meeting.
Okay, so anyways, so yeah, obviously I'm the author of BeerSmith 3. I actually do all the coding for everything. So I do the mobile version, the desktop version, the online tools that are coming online now, BeerSmithRecipes.com, which has, I think, 1.1 million recipes on it now. So all that stuff is done actually right here in this chair. Computer's right here to the right. And I do all that right here. So let me just tell you a little bit about BeerSmith. So BeerSmith is available for desktop platforms, Mac, PC, and Linux. And then it's also available in a mobile version on Google Play and also obviously the Apple, and then the Amazon store. Linux, I mainly support Ubuntu. So if you're an Ubuntu Linux guy, pretty easy to port. If you're not, you got a little more work to do. There's a lot of different flavors of Linux. Sean was asking me at the beginning what it was written in. It was actually written in C++. The main desktop program's in C++. The mobile version's in JavaScript primarily, web-based HTML5, and then the online version's HTML5, PHP, MySQL, all that other fun stuff. So lots of different words there. Anyways, just give you an idea what BeerSmith does. So these are some of the topics I'm going to cover today. How to set up your equipment profile, which is really important up front because you got to have your it's got to have some idea of what equipment you're brewing on, the volumes that you're working with, things like that in order to get good numbers out. So if you have a kind of a messed up equipment profile, it's going to create problems down the line when you start building recipes. Once you do have the equipment profile set up, though, it's pretty easy to build a recipe in the program. You basically just select ingredients, and we'll talk through the ingredient database and also how to get new ingredients. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that are available to adjust your recipe. We'll talk about mash calculations, Brewday features, which are nice for, using during the Brewday. There's a Brewday timer and there's a brew sheet kind of thing. We'll talk a little bit about the BeerSmith Cloud, how you can find recipes, share recipes on the BeerSmith Cloud, which is basically a giant online database at BeerSmithRecipes.com. But you can find and get and use recipes very easily from the cloud, which is nice. And then we'll talk a little about BeerSmith Mobile. I'll talk about inventory, shopping lists, some of the features in BeerSmith 3 you may not know about. And then I'll talk a little bit about BeerSmith 3.1, which is the update I'm working on, as well as some of the stuff I'm working on to build an online version of BeerSmith, which will be web-based. So what is BeerSmith? It's basically kind of an all-in-one tool for beer brewers. The goal is to help you make better beer, obviously. It's very recipe focused. So the main purpose is really creating your own recipes. And it also lets you do, nice things like adjusting recipes to fit your equipment. If somebody brewed it on a different set of equipment, or maybe you want to scale it up for commercial use, and I can talk to you about that too. You can do all that with BeerSmith. And in fact, there's, I believe, several thousand professional brewers who use BeerSmith for their breweries, used throughout the United States, actually around the world. I've had emails from people all over the world that are using it at their breweries now. On the BeerSmith Cloud, I mentioned there's actually over 1 million recipes there now. It lets you do record keeping, repeatability. The mobile version's nice because you can access your recipes remotely. You can even access them through the recipe site remotely now. The downside, of course, is there is a learning curve. The software is, a little bit complex. There's a lot of details that go into it because it is designed even for professional brewers. There's some things you have to learn up front, but honestly, with just a little bit of time, you can walk through a couple of the tutorials that are available online and get into the program fairly easily. And then you can start using some of the more advanced features as you need them. So the first thing I want to talk about is how to create an equipment profile. And an equipment profile is basically a little record in the program that tells what equipment you're working with, in particular, the volumes, the efficiency of the system, the losses in the system, things like boil off and so on. And the way this works is the program kind of works backwards from your batch volume. So if your batch volume, let's say you're a typical brewer, you make either 5 or 10 gallon batches, which are 19 or around 40 liters, 38 liters batches. Generally, that's what you start with, and that's described as the batch volume, and that's the volume into the fermenter. From there, it works backwards to calculate your pre-boil volume, factoring in things like what your boil off was, shrinkage. There's actually some volumetric shrinkage that happens when you cool the wort down. There's trube losses, of course, which happen in the kettle after you boil. And then some people use top-up water, particularly extract brewers usually top up and add water after the boil. So those are all numbers you can put into the system and then work backwards to your pre-boil volume. And then, of course, it'll work backwards from that to estimate what your mash volume is and what your sparge volume is. So the first time you use BeerSmith, if you want to go and look at the equipment profiles that are available, there's a number of pre-canned ones available with the program. You can also get new ones through the add-on feature, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But generally, you want to start with one of those profiles, or there's even an equipment wizard. There's this little thing under the insert menu that allows you to kind of walk through how to build an equipment profile for your batch of beer. But you really need to set this up front before you build the first recipe. You need to build one of these because that tells the program how big a system you're working with and how to calculate all the parameters for the beer. So this is important. The other thing I want to mention is a lot of people don't know, well, how do I dial it in? Let's say my volumes aren't matching up after I enter my numbers and so on, or my efficiency is not matching up. And it turns out you can dial in the profile over time as well, just by measuring the actual volumes as you're working and comparing them to the ones that you put in your equipment profile. And also, if you measure the gravities as well, you can put those into the mash profile tab, which we'll talk about in a minute. Or I'm sorry, the session profile tab, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's a place to record your session data from when you brew. And you can get a good comparison of, what was my actual efficiency versus my estimated efficiency. And in fact, I if you're into efficiency, I talked about that in a blog post that I put out this week. How to adjust your mash efficiency in BeerSmith is at the top of the blog at beersmith.com/blog right now. So once you have, here's what I was just talking about, perfecting your equipment profile. Basically, if you measure your volumes at each step, you understand your brew house efficiency, you can enter that in and you can adjust it over time and get things adjusted. The two numbers I wanted to highlight here, one of them is the brew house efficiency. A lot of people get confused as to what the brew house efficiency is. A brew house efficiency is your gross efficiency into the fermenter. So if you recall the presentation I did a couple weeks ago, I talked a little bit about how each of the grains, when you add a grain to your recipe, has a what's called a fine grain dry yield, which is kind of like the efficiency that you would expect if you're working in a laboratory. Well, none of us are really brewing in a laboratory, so we get numbers that are lower than that, and the lower number is the brew house efficiency, if you will. So if you think about if a grain has a certain amount of potential, and you have maybe a 72% brew house efficiency into the fermenter, then that means you get 72% of what the ideal value would be for that grain. And BeerSmith applies this grain by grain, so that's how it estimates your original gravity into the fermenter. The other thing I want to emphasize is the brew house efficiency isn't the same as the mash efficiency. Some people, some brewers do track mash efficiency. Mash efficiency only covers your losses into the mash, whereas brew house efficiency covers your whole, all your losses into the fermenter. So brew house efficiency is a number that ties to your original gravity, whereas mash efficiency is a number that just ties to your pre-boil gravity. That makes sense. And the other number I wanted to explain a little bit that's in the equipment profile is the mash tun heat capacity. That's really just a factor to try and estimate the heat absorbed by the mash tun. And this particularly is a concern if you're doing an infusion mash. You have to basically add a few extra degrees of hot water, if you will, a little bit extra temperature to the hot water, extra heat to it, in order to raise the temperature of your equipment. And so that really is captured in this mash tun heat capacity factor. And if your numbers, let me move my thing up here a little bit. If your actual mash temperature, let's say you're mashing in and you come in a little bit too low, then that means you actually need to raise this number a little bit in order to adjust it. If your mash temperatures come in a little too high, you may need to lower this number. And this is a equipment by equipment thing because it's hard for me to tell. A lot of it depends on what kind of material your mash tun's made out of. But your mash tun's going to absorb some heat from the grain as you mash in, and that's what this number is meant to represent. Okay, so once you have your equipment profile set up in the program, it really just becomes a matter of selecting your ingredients, and you do that from the design page that's shown right here. This is a desktop version. But up top, you can give you give a name to the recipe. You enter, you pick your equipment profile by clicking on the big button that says equipment there. And then you literally just start adding ingredients by using the choose ingredient buttons, which are on the right side there. And you build a list of ingredients for your recipe. As you're doing that, it'll update the color in the top right, and it'll also update the style comparison, which is in the kind of the middle there with the bars. You can probably see them. Let's see, mouse isn't really showing up. But where the style comparison is there. And so you can build the recipe there, right there, and it'll show you all this data as you're sort of building the recipes, as you're adding ingredients to it. It'll show you the estimated bitterness, the gravity, and so on. There's a variety of custom fields you can pull up on the right side. So people are going, well, I want to know, I think last time we talked about the sulfate to chloride ratio. Literally, you can bring that up there, or the bitterness ratio, or maybe you want the estimated final gravity, or any number of other things. You can bring those up by selecting them in that bottom right area, and you can customize that to use whatever you want. And then down at the very bottom, similar to the equipment profiles, there's pre-canned mash profiles and carbonation profiles and fermentation profiles, and you can select those there. And what that does is it's just a nice way of making it very easy to apply, a certain mash regime, for example, if you're an all-grain brewer, or a certain carbonation regime. Maybe you want a bottle with honey, I don't know, or something like that. And the software will do the calculations for you. Again, most of the ingredients and all the other stuff are preloaded when you start, and you can add new ones as well as you go. So here, again, to build a simple recipe, enter the name and recipe type at the top. Whether you're brewing with all grain or extract makes a big difference, obviously. You're going to select your equipment profile up front. You're going to select typically a target beer style that you're brewing with, and that'll drive those beer style indicators at the bottom. And then you just start adding ingredients. So it's fairly simple to do. I did mention you can add your own ingredients. A lot of people don't realize. I actually get a lot of people ask me the question, how can I add this hops or this, basically you go to ingredients on the menu, you go to ingredients, hops or grains or whatever you want, or yeast, and you can add a new hop variety or yeast variety or whatever you want right up there. Typically, you can pull the data from the manufacturer's website. So whoever's providing the malt or the hops or whatever, you can enter into the program. Another concept to understand, which a lot of people don't, is each recipe has a complete copy of the ingredients as brewed, if you will. And the reason this becomes important is, let's say I want to brew a recipe again, and I want to change my equipment profile, or I want to change some of the ingredients that I'm working with. Maybe I'm working with a different hop variety, or the hop alpha is different because I bought a different package of hops. It's important to realize that if I make a copy of that old recipe and use it, it's going to have whatever it was originally, right? So if I've updated my equipment profile, I probably need to reselect it to bring it in. And the reason for this, the reason we keep everything as brewed is because you want a historical record of how you brewed things when you brewed them. You don't want it to automatically update because I change, imagine if you're a commercial brewer and I don't know, somebody changes a hop entry or something, and now it's going to go and change all the old recipes. You don't really want that. You want a record of everything as you brewed it. But it becomes important because if you start changing, and if you update recipes or you update particularly your equipment profile or maybe your mash profile or something like that, you may need to go and reselect it when you brew a recipe that you brewed before. And then you also have the option, because everything has a complete copy of its ingredients, you really have these two options of sort of customizing things. Let's say, a good example is hops. When I buy a package of Fuggles today, it might be 5%. And next time I go to the brew store, it might be 6% or something like that. Okay. I can either edit that ingredient within the recipe, in which case it just changes for that one recipe, which might make sense for something like hops, right? I don't necessarily want to change the master entry for Fuggles. I just want to change the alpha for this current recipe, right? So I'll literally just click on that recipe and say, okay, the package, I'm looking at says 6% today, and I put 6% in for my Fuggles and I'm ready to go. The other way to edit ingredient, of course, is to edit from the ingredients view, which changes sort of the master copy, if you will. And that'll change it anytime I pull in, if I change Fuggles there to 6%, then anytime I go build a new recipe with Fuggles, it's going to default to 6%. Make sense? So, you got this, you got a local copy, if you will, in the recipe, then you got the original back in the sort of the master database, which is your ingredient or profile views. But that does give you a lot of flexibility depending on what you're working with. I mentioned you can get new ingredients really easy and new stuff. You can actually get profiles as well. You can download, let's say you buy a new Blickman system, you can download a Blickman profile for it. I think all the way up to 7 barrels if you want. So you go to File, Add-ons, and you can get new add-ons for anything. You can get new ingredients, you can get new fruits, you can get new malts, you can get hop varieties, you can get recipe packs, you can get equipment profiles. There's even mash profiles out there. And it's a nice way of keeping the program up to date, because let's say I'm brewing with crisp malts. You can download all the crisp malts in one shot. Or I use BeerSmith malts a lot, so I can download all the BeerSmith malts in one shot. So basically you go to add-ons and you just pick the type of data you're working on. I think this one's showing yeasts, but you can pick equipment profiles or grains or whatever, and you click on the update and you just install it, and it installs it into your program, and now it's there in your database. You can use it. And there's literally hundreds of these things that you can download online. And I do update them as often as I can. I finally got to the point where most of the manufacturers are sending me updates now, which is quite nice. So a lot of times I do get their up-to-date stuff. I talked a little bit about matching a style in that design page. I'm just sort of showing the bottom corner of it here. But as you're building the recipe, the style sliders are going to give you a visual indicator of the original gravity, the bitterness, the color, the ABV, and it's going to compare it to the target style that you're working with. So if you're, and typically most of us are working with a BJCP style guide, which is installed by default. So you just literally click on the button there to pick your style. This one's showing a strong bitter. And then you can go in and as you're building your recipe, it'll show you, how you're doing with the original gravity, the bitterness, the color, the estimated ABV, which is largely driven by the yeast selection you made, because it's estimating the original gravity based on the yeast selection as well as the grain bill that you have. But it'll give you an idea of how the final beer might turn out and how it is relative to the style that you're working with. There's a whole bunch of tools. This is in the recipe builder to allow you to adjust your recipe. So let's say you built a recipe and you want to adjust it. So maybe I'm brewing, I brewed a 5-gallon recipe before, and now I want to make a 10-gallon recipe, or I want to double the size of it. I can use a scale recipe button to do that. These are all the buttons are at the top there. The best way to do that, honestly, is to switch from one equipment profile to another, which you can do right in that scale recipe button. You literally just click on scale recipe. you pick your new equipment profile, and it'll scale everything to match that, including the losses and the sizes and the mash, all the calculations that you need to do. There's another button to convert between all grain and extract, which is nice. So if you're an extract brewer and you want to convert an all grain recipe, it'll do that. One minor warning with that, it does have trouble. It tends to go a little flaky when you have really, really light pale recipes. And the reason for that is simply that there are not that many pale extracts. It turns out the process you use to make malt extract it requires you to, the manufacturer, in order to make malt extract, dry malt extract, liquid malt extract, what they're actually doing is they're boiling that they're boiling wort. So they brew beer just like anybody would with a mashing process. They create wort and then they concentrate it down. And typically what they'll do is they'll boil it under a vacuum so that it's at lower temperature, but it still darkens the wort considerably. So it becomes really hard to match some really light beers. In addition to that, there's an adjust gravity button, which lets you set the original gravity, an adjust bitterness button, which lets you set the IBUs by adjusting the hop quantities. The color button lets you set the color of the beer. I'll point out, obviously you have to have ingredients in order to use any of these buttons really properly, because if I've had people go, well, the adjust bitterness doesn't work, and then they don't have any actual hops in the thing yet. Particularly on the mobile version, people tend to send me that question. And then there's a grain percent, which is really nice for setting the grain percent for each item. That's actually down by, it's a smaller button, but it's down by the add buttons. And there's even an IBU one, which lets you set individual IBU contributions for each of the hops, which is kind of neat. So, it gives you a lot of flexibility, and I'll demonstrate that on the next slide here. So let's say I'm building a recipe and I'm lazy, because I am. Excuse me. So I'm building a recipe, I'm lazy. So I can literally just go in and set my grains. Let's say I know I want to use these 5 grains in my recipe, okay? And I'm going to literally just go and add a pound of each, because I really don't care that much. And then I'm going to go and just click on the grain percent button to set the grain percentage. And now I'll actually set the numbers that I want. I'll say I want 71% Maris Otter. I want 15% flake corn. I want 7% crystal, and so on and so on. I just set those numbers there. And then I push OK, and now it's going to adjust everything, but it's still going to be really small numbers, right? It's going to be, 0.7 pounds of this and 0.2 pounds of that and whatever. Well, now I just click on the adjust a gravity button to set my target gravity. And so I'm going to set it to, let's say it's a 1050 beer or something like that. And I push OK on that. And now it's all the grain amounts are going to be boosted up so they match my system. So, I brew with a 10-gallon system. So I'm probably going to get, instead of 0.7 pounds of pale malt, I'm probably going to have like 17 pounds of pale malt now. And now I can do the same sort of thing with hops. I can just pick the hops that I want and then click on the adjust bitterness button and get up to the hop levels I want. So what I've done is, with very little effort, I've built a recipe that has exactly the grain percents I want, exactly the gravity I want, and exactly the IBUs I want. Just by using the tools that are available in the program. This is the Brewday timer feature and the brew sheet feature. Once you've built a recipe in the program, you can also just click on either the Brewday timer, if you want to use the timer for the mash or boil steps, or you can click on the brew sheet button, which is up near the top right. And the brew sheet button will actually show you step-by-step instructions for brewing your recipe. So it's got all the ingredients, it's got when to add them, what the quantities are and everything. And so you can take the brew sheet and walk out in the garage and use it, or, you can take your laptop out and use the timer as well. And the timer shows, when to do the mash steps, when to add the boil additions, all that other stuff as you're brewing. So 2 very useful aids for building the beer. And I mean, it shows everything. It shows the carbonation steps, the mash steps, everything. After you just literally had to pick a couple ingredients to build the recipe. Here's another feature a lot of people don't know about. So the question I get often is, how do I manage multiple copies of my recipe? I've got, I brewed this recipe 3 or 4 times, and it doesn't make a copy every time. How do I do this? So Excuse me. A little dry today. So basically what I do is every time I brew a recipe, I'll update the brew date on it, obviously the date that I brewed it. And then typically I'll bump the version number. So there's this little version number that's on the top right on the design screen, just so I can keep track of the versions of them. And then after I brew and record all the data in the recipe, I'll use the copy to log button, which is up there in the center. And what that does is it copies that recipe to the brew log directory. So now the brew log folder in the program actually has a record of every single recipe that I brewed. So I can open up the brew log at any point and pull up any recipe that I brewed. It's got the date that I brewed it, and it's also got the hopefully a version number on it, right? And now when I'm done with that process, if I brew it again in my main folder where I got my working recipes, if you will, I will simply clear out the session data and brew it again. And then I'll enter all the session data in, and then I'll push this button again to copy it to the brew log. So it's a nice way to keep track of all the recipes that you brewed, and at any point you want, you can go into the brew log and pull up the recipe and look at, again, how it was brewed. Next is the BeerSmith Recipes Cloud here. So, BeerSmithRecipes.com is a website you can go to at any time. You can log in with your password. A lot of people don't know you can manage your license from there. If you've got BeerSmith 3, the license actually shows up on the profile page. But here you can also find you can set up a free account or just search directly. There's over 1 million recipes on there. I think it's over 1.1 million as of today. And you can access that from the web. You can access it from your phone now. You can access it from the mobile version of BeerSmith using the cloud search features, and you can access it directly from the desktop program. On the desktop program, there's a cloud search view as well that lets you search recipes on BeerSmithRecipes.com and pull them right into the program. And I'll demonstrate how you might use that in a minute. But it's a great resource. You can rate recipes there as well. And there are a number of highly rated recipes. Some of them are actually quite good. You can access from the main page. So a lot of flexibility. This thing serves many functions. It allows public sharing of recipes. So you can mark any of your recipes as shared if you've got them in your cloud folder. It allows private sharing of recipes, which is what most people do. Let's say I want to share recipes between two of my computers, or I want to access recipes from my phone. Literally all I do is take that recipe, copy and paste it into the cloud folder on the program. It then gets stored on the server, and now I can access it from any of these different platforms. I wanted to talk about how to use a recipe that you might pull down from the cloud. Let's say I found a recipe I really like I think one of the top rated recipe right now is like Bell's Two Hearted or something like that, clone. You can literally, you can use a cloud search program in BeerSmith or mobile version to find the recipe just by name or by style. You can sort it by rating. If you want to see the top rated recipes, you can do that on the mobile or the desktop. And then, all you have to do is make a local copy of that recipe, which is really easy. There's a button there to actually make a copy of that recipe. And what it'll do is it'll store a recipe in one of your folders. So once you've got that local copy, you just edit the local copy and click on the scale recipe button that we discussed earlier. And then you pick your equipment profile there on the right. And then you push OK. And so what's happened there is we've taken somebody else's recipe and we've scaled it to match our equipment profile, and now we can basically brew it. That's the whole process that you have to go through. So it's not too hard to find recipes that you like, and it's not too hard to scale them to match your equipment profile. So now you can brew them. So I mean, literally, I could within probably less than a minute, I could find a recipe I like, make a local copy of it, open it up, scale it, and then click on the brew sheet to print out a brew sheet, and I could go out in the garage and brew it. That's kind of a neat feature. I mentioned some of the different sharing options. If you set up a cloud account at BeerSmithRecipes.com, or if you've already bought the program, you probably already have a cloud account at BeerSmithRecipes.com. You just log into it. And then you can copy items back and forth to the cloud. I want to talk about sharing options, though. Recipes are private by default. So anything that you put in the cloud folder is going to be private by default. And if you're running BeerSmith 3, it's actually pretty secure because it's also going over an HTTPS connection. So nobody else can see that. And then you also have the option to mark them as public. So you have the option to put them, if you mark a recipe as public, now it's going to show up in the searchable database of all the recipes, and other people can find that recipe, and they can also rate that recipe once it's public. And then finally, BeerSmith 3 also adds an unlisted option. So if you take if you take a recipe and you mark it as unlisted, it's not going to show up in the public search results, but there is an ID that'll be shown there, and you can share that ID with your friend if you only want a limited number of people to access it. So it's basically not listed in the search results. Anyways, anything you put in your cloud account is going to show up on your other machines or phones if you're logged into that same account. So you can access the recipe from any of those accounts or devices. I think I talked a little bit about this in the previous presentation, but they're under the tools menu. There's a whole bunch of tools here. There they are listed. And there's things for all kinds of things. So you can do unit conversions, which is useful. You can adjust the gravity of the mash, for example, or even your final beer by using the adjust gravity tool, and it'll allow you, let's say I was way off on my gravity and I need a couple more points. It'll tell me how much dry malt extract to add or liquid malt extract to add if I need to, maybe adjust my beer just a little bit before I start fermenting it. There's hydrometer and refractometer tools for correcting your refractometer hydrometer readings if they're taken at a different temperature, or in the case of a refractometer, you really need to correct almost anything once the beer starts fermenting because of the nature of the refractometer. You have to use that tool to get an accurate reading out of it. There's infusion decoction calculators. There's water profile tools to match a given water profile. And I'll talk more about water profiles in a minute. There's carbonation tools. There's a whole bunch of really useful tools in there. You can get the amount of beer in your keg by weighing the keg, for example. There's a weight to volume tool for doing that. So there's a ton of stuff here that people really haven't, a lot of people don't even know exists. And I want to mention too, all these tools are now also available on BeerSmithRecipes.com, and you can access them both from the mobile and desktop via the web, just by logging into your account if you have a Gold Plus account, I think. BeerSmith also has an inventory feature, so you can take a recipe, you can add it to the shopping list, and it'll literally take all the ingredients in the recipe and add it to the shopping list view. You can print out that shopping list view, go to the local store, get your ingredients that you want. Then you can pick those shopping list ingredients and add them to the inventory view. And again, there's an inventory view where you can view your inventory of ingredients that you have in stock. And then you can remove a recipe from inventory just by clicking on that remove from inventory button, and sort of completes the whole cycle here. So it's a way of managing your inventory of ingredients, if you like. I use a shopping list feature quite a bit when I'm trying to build a list of ingredients, especially if I've been working with multiple recipes. It'll kind of add them together for you. So that's how the inventory system works. And then I mentioned BeerSmith 3 was released, like a year and a half ago, and it's got a lot of nice features in it. In particular, it now supports mead, wine, and cider. So you can build mead, wine, and cider recipes, which if you don't make mead, wine, or cider, if you're just a beer person, you already have all the ingredients you need to make mead, wine, or cider on hand, because it's basically, you have all the equipment you need on hand to make those. So it is kind of fun to do that. For example, mead is gotten incredibly easy to make. You just take water and honey, basically, and I like to throw a lot of fruit in it, and you mix it up in a large sterilized fermenter, and that's about it. And then you throw, they have these new fermentation nutrients that you add, and you do that. It's called a staggered nutrient addition, and it turns out it's very easy to make mead at home, and it's quite delicious, actually. Anyway, so the program also supports fruits, juices, and honey now. They're all native to the program. So if let's say I'm working with fruit juice that I bought from the store, I have no idea what the gravity, how to enter it in the program or whatever. You can literally just create a new fruit juice ingredient and drop your hydrometer into your fruit juice to take a measurement and enter that hydrometer reading in. And the program will take care of integrating that all into your profiles, which is nice. BeerSmith 3 also has a bunch of new brewing features. It's got integrated water profile adjustments. You can play with your water profiles right in the recipe builder now. It's got mash pH adjustment in the recipe builder. There's cloud folders. There's a ton of stuff in BeerSmith 3. This is a mead example, but you can, there's a whole bunch of honey varieties, ingredients now preloaded for mead. The fruits are adjustable by the brie or sugar level. You can take that reading with a hydrometer. There's a nutrient calculator built in. If you're into mead, you can do either the Tansa or Tinosa, which is the organic or not inorganic nutrient calculations right in the program. There's new yeast tolerance stuff in there, so you can do high gravity meads or high gravity beers. The previous version didn't have alcohol tolerance in it. The new one does. So, once you reach the alcohol tolerance of your particular yeast you're working with, it'll actually top out, and you won't give you an accurate final gravity reading. I did talk about the water matching tool. So right within the BeerSmith recipe builder, there's a water tab now where you can build your water profiles. And this is actually pretty sophisticated. So you can actually start with any water profile as a base. So if you got your local water profile, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, you can enter that into the program, and you can use that as a base for your water building. You can also blend. So we were talking about maybe diluting. You might have to, if your water profile is not good, you can dilute it with maybe distilled water or RO water. You can actually do that right in the program and say, I'm going to use, 5 gallons of my base water, and then I'm going to use 2 gallons or 7 gallons or whatever of RO water, and it'll blend in and calculate the water profile right there in the program. And then you can also do a matching thing where you literally say, I want to match my water profile against the one from, I don't know, Dublin, Ireland. And you can pick the target profile as Dublin, Ireland, and push a button, and it'll actually calculate all the water salt additions that you need for the program. And it'll display those, and you'll have the option to add them right as ingredients in the recipe right there. So kind of a nice feature. And then the water analysis also feeds into the mash pH estimation, which is nice too for all grain brewers, which we have on this slide. Basically what the program does is based on your grain profiles and your water profile, it will estimate the mash pH that's unadjusted for the grist, for the mash, if you will. And then it'll also give you the option to add acid additions. So you could add lactic acid or acid malt, which we talked about last time, as an ingredient in your recipe, and it'll give you the unadjusted and the adjusted mash pH based on that addition. And it supports lactic, phosphoric, and acid malts. And it does have a little acid calculator in the bottom right, so you can make final adjustments too. So if you're using that strategy that I talked about earlier, where maybe you start with a certain grain profile and a certain water profile, and I add some of the lactic acid up front to get myself down into the good range, and then I take a pH measurement, I can then use that little calculator on the bottom right to calculate a final adjustment. Like maybe I need just a little more lactic acid to get exactly where I want to be. Whole bunch of new other stuff, support for Whirlpool hop options, no chill brewing. The Whirlpool hop calculator is actually very sophisticated. It uses both time and temperature for all your Whirlpool hop additions. So you can actually get an accurate bitterness estimate on the Whirlpool hops that you add. You can now do 2-stage yeast starters in the recipe builder. It has options for doing a 2-stage yeast starter if you're working with maybe just a packet of yeast and you want to step it up for doing a large batch. I mentioned cloud folders. It's got high altitude brewing options. If you're brewing at altitude, you can put that into your equipment profile and say, I'm brewing at, 1,000 meters, and it'll do the calculations for, because it turns out if you're brewing at altitude, it affects not only your bitterness calculations, but a variety of other calculations, because the boil temperature is lower. And then a huge number of changes to the databases. BeerSmith 3 mobile's available. It basically has virtually all the desktop changes incorporated in, including mead, wine, and cider, cloud folders, mash pH, adjustment tools, two-stage yeast starters, and a whole bunch of other stuff in there. And that's available on Android, iPhone, iPad, etc. I did phase out the light version. It turns out the light version of BeerSmith, I incorporated into the changes we're going to talk about in a minute, but the light version of BeerSmith is actually built into BeerSmithRecipes.com now. So if you access BeerSmithRecipes.com, you log into your account and you're a Gold Plus member, you basically get the same features that you had in the light version on the mobile store. The BeerSmith Recipes update, which I released last fall, included a whole bunch of changes to the recipe site. And I'm working on a web-based version as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the biggest change probably is that I made the whole site mobile friendly now. So you can go to BeerSmithRecipes.com from your phone and have good access to all your recipes. You can find recipes, you can search recipes, you can change things. You can access all these tools that I talked about online. And they're all available in a mobile format that they weren't before. I also have the full suite of brewing tools there now. So all the things that were on the tools menu and the unit tools menu in BeerSmith are available online now. And you can use all those tools. I think somebody asked me last time about the mash pH acid adjustment. The new version of BeerSmith is going to have the ability to select different models for the mash pH acid adjustment. Some people prefer the so-called, the brew and water model that generally gives you lower numbers. Some like the MPH model, which I've been using. But there are several different models for calculating a lot of these pH parameters. And the online tool here actually has some of those new features incorporated. The desktop version, which I'm getting ready to release, also has the new version, those new alternate models. And then this is also the framework for the online version of BeerSmith, which I've started working on, that'll eventually give you the ability to build recipes on the web from anywhere, pretty much, which a lot of people have been asking for. The desktop update that is going out to beta testers right now includes those alternate pH adjustment models we talked about. Tilt import. Tilt is the digital hydrometer that's become quite popular. You'll be able to import those through Google Spreadsheet or CSV files. New dry hop settings for fermentation. A lot of people are dry hopping in the primary now or in the secondary now, and not just before bottling. So there's some new features to support that. A lot of under the hood changes. Transactional data storage actually saves the data immediately when you added it, which is nice. You won't have these kinds of little mini crashes where I've had issues where people crash, the software crashes or something, or their laptop shuts down, or they didn't charge it or whatever, and they start losing data. So that shouldn't happen anymore. I revamped the whole storage model, and that also actually lays the groundwork for the online version, because in the future, we'll be able to do immediate ingredient sync online and things like that, recipe sync online, because now I'm working with a transactional database on the desktop. It's very easy to make those transactions go over the cloud. So a lot of under the hood stuff, but very important stuff really for the long-term BeerSmith. And then there's better backup, recover and zip, and there's a huge number of bug fixes, a lot of little features that people wanted added. And then finally, I'm working on BeerSmith Online, which will be the web-based version of BeerSmith. It'll be based on the browser at BeerSmithRecipes.com. The tools are already online now, but the recipe builder I'm still working on. But that's kind of nice. And then finally, a lot of people have been asking for this for years, but the option to sync your profiles, ingredients, and inventory data between the desktop and the web kind of fits in with all this, under the hood work I've been doing, and also the web-based version that I've been working on. So that's where I'm going with BeerSmith next. And with that, there's a couple things I want to mention before I get off, I guess. One, I wanted to mention at the top there is video tutorials. If you go to beersmith.com/video, there's a whole bunch of video tutorials on how to use BeerSmith, particularly if you're setting it up for the first time. So like if you want to walk through how do I actually create an equipment profile? How do I build a recipe? A lot of people don't know which buttons to push right up front, but you watch the video and you go, okay, this is how I add a grain. This is how I add this. This is how I scale a recipe. The other one I want to mention is the blog. I published several weeks ago now, I guess during the beginning of this whole coronavirus thing, an index to all my articles at the blog. And to get to it, if you go to beersmith.com/blog and you click on the guide button, which is the very, very top of the page, you can actually access that index. And that index has, 360 articles I've written on homebrewing, which are useful. But there's also a whole section on BeerSmith articles that include how to use a whole bunch of features in BeerSmith. And there's probably, 40 or 50 articles there on BeerSmith that you can access as well. I do have a discussion forum and on and on and on. So most of you are familiar with the podcast, the blog, some of the other stuff that I do. The newsletter is also quite useful. If you're not on the newsletter, go to beersmith.com and just sign up. There's a box on the right sidebar where you can add yourself to the newsletter. And if you join the newsletter, you get an article on homebrewing every week sent to your inbox. And there's actually, 80, 90,000 people that get that every week. Okay, enough about that. Be happy to take questions at this point. Should I leave that up for a second in case anybody's copying the links?
Okay. So for the questions, if anybody wants to, it would probably be best if you just enter your question into the chat box, and we'll go from there.
Because I don't know how to do that, I'm just going to ask my question. Okay. Is there a RoboBrew profile in your new system?
I believe there is under the add-ons. Yeah, I'm pretty sure there is. I'd have to check right now, but I believe RoboBrew has sent me some profiles. Hang on. Let me check.
Okay. Well, then that was the main question I had on my brain, John. Thank you.
I think Kegland might have added the profiles for
okay.
the RoboBrew. I think Jeff was mentioning.
Yeah, I do see him. I do see him there actually. I just pulled it up on my computer over the side. Sorry.
Oh, good. That was the one thing that I had just thinking about. I might have think of more.
No problem.
Okay, Ken's got a question there in the chat.
Oh, sure. Ken's question: what made you decide to create the program? So I actually started this project back in 2002, which is a while ago. And I originally wrote the program because there was some programs available. Probably the biggest one at that time was one called ProMash, which I don't know if many of you heard of, written by Jeff Donovan. And I was not really happy with the way he had set up the program. It was kind of, very file based. You had to open a file and then open another file and then do this and that. And so, so I started writing this as a tool for myself, actually, just for my own use. And then, some of my friends liked it, and a couple of people helped me develop it into a product over about a period of about a year, I guess. And then I put it out, and it was kind of a hobby thing for many years till about probably 2008, 2009. It was more of a hobby, making a few bucks on the side, until I kind of figured out some of this internet stuff with the marketing end and the blogging and all the other stuff. And then I was able to retire. I actually retired out of my regular day job, which I think I mentioned was the Air Force, in 2010. And I've been doing this for almost 10 years now, full time, which is great. Other questions?
Kyle has a question there.
I got to scroll down. Hang on. It's not scrolling. Kyle. Go ahead.
You got it?
Yeah, I got it now. Kyle says, love the podcast. Listen while walking the dog, keeps us both healthy. I exclusively use the mobile version. Any reason why I can't manipulate recipe by grain percentage? I don't have all the features on the mobile version. I do on the desktop. I will try and make a note to maybe add that one though, because it's not a huge change. But yeah, it's one of the things I struggle with on the mobile version is, you know, you have a limited amount of space in terms of memory and time and everything else. I mean, memory and particularly screen space is difficult to deal with. So it's a little more complicated to do some of the more complicated stuff, like, you know, say you want to manipulate the water profiles. It's hard to fit that into a, you know, little phone screen. But yeah, I can probably add the grain percentage tool. That one is not that hard to add. Ken Allen asking, sorry if you covered this already. I was wondering how to add the grain percent feature in my software. I can probably show you. Let's see if I can get it up here. Show you where that button is, but it's near the add buttons in the program. If you give me a second, I'll pull it up. So if I open a recipe, here we go. I'm going to switch screens here real quick. So if I pull up a recipe, there's all the add buttons: add hops, add misc, add this, add that, and the grain percent and the hop IBU buttons are over here. So if I click on the right, hopefully you can see that. If I click on the grain percent, you can see it brings up the grain percentages, and I can play with those. Or if I click on the hop IBUs, it allows me to adjust the different IBUs levels for each edition, so I can actually adjust it by edition. Okay. Let's see, next one. In terms of ton temperature, is there a way to calculate the temperature variations by adding water and grain? There's no easy way to calculate it up front. You can estimate it based on what kind of material you're working with. And I think the program, if you open up the equipment profile editor, it does have the different materials listed. So, you know, if you're working with a plastic mash tun, like I did for many years, and you got one of those igloo coolers, it gives you a value to start with for there. If you're working with a stainless steel mash tun, it's got a value to add there. You know, you may not even need this particular feature if you're working with something like, you know, sophisticated, like a rim system, because the system itself is going to, you know, maintain the temperature automatically, if you will. But it's mainly for people who are doing infusions, either into a, you know, traditional mash tun kind of a thing. But what I would recommend is start with that value and then actually brew the beer. And if you come up a little short or a little high, adjust that value just a little bit. Okay, let's see. I got to scroll down again. Sorry, my mouse is way over here. I saw in BeerSmith 3, there's an archive feature. Not sure what that's used for, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, the archive feature I put in because of exactly what you're saying. He's saying if I go crazy modifying a recipe, am I going to have a problem? And I actually put that feature in just for that. What the recipe archive does, if you go to, let me blow it up here. I go, let's say, close this. And I go to recipes, recipe archive. It actually has a list of every single major modification or at least all the recent ones that I've made to a recipe, listed by recipe name and also listed by date. So what you can do there is, let's say I am working with my, I don't know, this is just a WIT, this is a test recipe, but still, I can pull up that version of that recipe and that edit that I made on whatever date it was. This was in 23rd of April, whatever. And I can pull up that version of that recipe. And if I want to, I can save a copy of it up here. So basically the program is archiving almost every single recipe edit that you make. And that can be useful if you've made a mistake with a recipe, or more likely if you've deleted a recipe by accident. You can actually go to the archive and recover individual recipes or individual changes. Or maybe I went nuts and I changed something I didn't want to change. You can go back a couple versions and find it. And the other nice thing is, if you go up here on the search box, you can search by name. So let's say if I type in WIT, it'll pull up just the edits I made to my WIT recipes, right? Which is kind of nice. Okay. Scrolling down again. Let's see. Ray batch volume. This is from Kyle. I tend to lose volume both post mash and post boil. Any recommendations? The key measurements I should be dialing in to tighten those up. I don't know if you're asking about dialing in the measurement, the software, or dialing in the. The software. It's pretty straightforward for post mash. There's actually there's two adjustments in the mash profile. The equipment profile for mash. One of them is basically a recoverable dead space, if you will. It's space that you might have below your mash screen, but it's recoverable in the sense that you can get that out of the mash and into the actual boiler. And then there's, if you will, the non-recoverable option, which is also called the dead space. And that is volume that is lost and can't be recovered. So that may be like let's say you got an area below your mash tun screen that is also below where you siphon off the wort. So you're going to lose some volume in there. The other adjustment that you mentioned is losses post-boil. That's included in your true loss measurement in the equipment profile. So if I've got, I don't know, I'm working with a 10-gallon system and I've got half a gallon of wort left at the bottom when I finish that I can't get out, or maybe it's just true, I'll put that in as a true loss. So that's how you dial it in to get the program right to match your numbers. But as far as actually how do you minimize those losses, there's a whole bunch of ways. The first one really has to do mostly with equipment design. The second, the boil stuff, is really how well you can separate the hops and other matter from your wort. Okay. See, I lost the chat for a minute here. The next one is from Sean. I use notes quite heavily. Is there any plans to add rich text support? Be able to do some simple text formatting would be amazing. Yeah, I have looked at doing it. I haven't implemented it yet because it's one of the challenges trying to get it the same across all the platforms is hard. For example, it might be really easy to get rich text on the desktop on the, I don't know, Windows version, but then when I try and put that online and then also put it on the mobile, it gets a little more complicated. I'd have to build some kind of an HTML editor probably to get it to work across all the platforms. So, anyways. Miss Craig's question. Did I miss one? I apologize. Craig, does the software support mixing beer, wine, and cider ingredients? For instance, maybe beer flavored cider. You can do it to some degree. It depends on what you're doing. Personally, when I work with, let's say I want to mix cider and beer, or more often I'll mix beer and mead to make what's called braggot. Typically what I will do, just to keep things simple, is I will make a beer and then I will make a mead and then I will blend them to taste at the end. And the reason to do that is getting those flavors to balance perfectly is pretty hard to do up front a lot of times. And I would say probably the same thing with cider and beer. It's probably easier to make a cider and make a beer and then blend them to taste. You do that by, taking, I don't know, like 100 milliliters of beer and then pouring in just the, measured amounts of cider. You take a bunch of samples, you put 100 milliliters in each of beer, and then you put varying amounts of cider in that. For example, if I'm mixing beer and cider, until I get the taste balance that I want. And it's much easier to do that post-fermentation than it is pre-fermentation. There are tools for doing some of the calculations for that. Like there's a dilution tool that lets you figure out what the gravity is if you start blending two different things. But I mean, if you really wanted to put the cider in up front, you can go into BeerSmith, you can brew a beer or build a beer recipe, and then you can add the cider in the secondary, or cider juice in the secondary, or apple juice in the secondary, for example. And it'll allow you to do that. So, I mean, that is possible, but I'm just saying from a practical standpoint, it's actually easier to do it the other way a lot of times. But I mean, a good example of where you might do this is, let's say I want to make a raspberry flavored beer. I can add that raspberry juice or whatever I'm working with, or raspberry fruit, in the secondary. And if you're working with fruit, here's a tip. If you're working with fruit and you don't have any idea what the gravity of the fruit is going to be, the best way to get it is actually to crush up a little bit of the fruit and get some juice from the fruit, and then put your hydrometer into that, or maybe use a refractometer if you want, and get an accurate Brie reading or Plato reading off of that, and then you can enter that into the software and get. That's actually the best way to work with fruit. Okay, let's see here. I think that's. Do we miss any more? Did I get them all, Sean?
I think that guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was all the questions so far. I think we'll do a last call for questions. Oh, Curtis just asked one.
Okay, let me scroll down. Will you add alcohol dilution to the dilution tool? Brew a 7% cider. I want to back sweeten with juice and drop to 5%. Well, there is a back sweeten tool you can use to calculate the back sweetening, which is useful. Let's see. I think you can do some of that. I never tried doing a dilution tool with that particular scenario, but let's just pull it up here. So I think you can actually do this now. I may be wrong, but take a look at this. I'm going to start with the dilution tool, which I know you probably can't read it very well, but I can enter a volume and a gravity up front of what I'm starting with. Okay. And then I can dilute that with wort or beer, and I can enter a volume of gravity and a volume here, and it will calculate the resulting specific gravity here at the end. So, I mean, that does give you an idea. I guess it doesn't actually give you the alcohol percentage, but it gives you the final gravity of the two things. Let's see, to calculate the alcohol percentage, you probably could actually do it from the gravity here if you had the starting gravity of the two original ones, but I don't have it in here. Good point. I mean, I maybe from these two items, I could get this. Well, I'd have to have the starting gravities for both really to get the ABV of the result. So yeah, I guess it doesn't give you an exact match in terms of gravities for what you're doing. But it turns out that calculation is actually not that complicated. You can calculate the ABV of the result. The only hard part is alcohol has a gravity below zero. So depending on the alcohol content, you got to mix the two. But I'm trying to think if there's an easy way to get that. Probably if you have the weighted. So if you started with the weighted, let me think this through. It's a linear relationship. So if you started with like weighted original gravity for the two things that you're working with. So let's say I'm adding, I don't know, 2 gallons of beer at 5, that started at a certain gravity, and I've got 1 gallon of cider that started at a certain gravity. If I use the weighted average of those two to get the original gravity, and then I use this tool, the dilution tool that I just showed you there, to get the final gravity, I could probably just enter that into the ABV calculator and get an accurate ABV for the mixture. Does that make sense? Because the gravities and the ABVs are pretty much linear. So I think that would give you a good number. So that's one way to do it. It's a little more complicated, but I think you could probably calculate that weighted average pretty well. Let's see. Is there a tool to calculate the pre-sparge gravity? Question from Tyler. The pre-sparge gravity, no, I don't have a way to calculate the pre-sparge gravity currently in the program. I'm not quite sure how to estimate it. It probably could be done. It would be, yeah, actually it could be done because you would just you need the volume of water that you're using, and you just need the weight of the grain, basically. Would give you a pretty good idea of what the gravity comes out. So no, I don't have that built in right now, but it wouldn't be that hard to add. Okay.
Awesome. Are there any other questions? Looks like we'll just give a second just in case someone's typing. But otherwise,
well, Sean, thank you.
No problem. Thank you for doing this for a second time. and we really appreciate it. If ever you're in Winnipeg, let us know. We'll definitely.
I hope to get back up there again. I think I mentioned I enjoy fishing and hunting and all that stuff. So,
well, absolutely.
We've been trying to plan a fishing trip forever up there, but there's some nice fishing up there.
Yeah, so. Well, we could definitely get you set up with that. And
when's the best time to go? I had my friends and I were arguing this. One of them was saying, "Oh, we should go in June," and I'm like, "I think the black flies are still out in June. I don't know."
Yeah, it's well, I mean that depending on where you go, that's going to be kind of a year-round thing. But
yeah,
yeah, I mean definitely early and late season is good for in terms of bugs. We used to plan a May-long weekend trip every year.
May.
Yeah, but yeah, really, it's if you have a boat and you can get out on the water too, that's even better. But yeah, no, it's oh, Ken says May, June is the best.
Is that the best? Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been there. I went in. I'm trying to think. The last time we were up there was August, and there weren't any black flies, but there were mosquitoes like the plague. It was bad.
Yeah, well, we need the industrial mosquito spray that you guys got in the U.S. That I don't know. It's not 100% deep.
Craig says I've seen mosquitoes.
Cancer, it may not work.
Craig says I've seen mosquitoes crawling on the snow in early spring. That doesn't surprise me either. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I've seen similar things. So they're tough.
I remember we went on a big canoe trip. We were lying in the tent at night. And it sounded like you were living inside of a beehive or something. They were just everywhere. You know. Yeah. But anyway, I don't want to tie up any more time. Thank you again, Sean. Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for doing this again, and we'll be in touch. I look forward to the BeerSmith 3.1. Any ideas and when that'll be released?
Well, I'm going to beta testers this week. Everything on the Mac went well, so I still got to do the Linux port, but hoping to get that out in a few weeks. I hope. Certainly, hopefully by the end of May at least. Just depends on how many bugs everybody finds once I get it out to everybody. So.
Nice.
Anyways, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you again, and we'll talk soon. I'm going to stop the recording here. But if anybody wants to